Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Embedding Art in Research with Rani Pramesti and Lena Nahlous. My name is Frances, and I am delighted to be your host for today. But first, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many countries throughout Australia and from where you are all joining us from today. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters upon which I am lucky enough to live, work and play here in Sydney. I pay my deep respects to their elders, past, present and future, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. If you would like to, I encourage you to share in the chat which country you are joining us from. Currently on site is a blue PowerPoint slide with a gold semicircle in the top right-hand corner. There is some gold, orange and white text and video boxes with our guest speakers and Auslan interpreter, Shavoy. I am a woman in my early 30s with fair skin, wavy blonde hair, blue eyes, and today wearing a high contrast dress with a pink color, orange sleeves, and black and white patterned front. In the background is my living room. There are some plants, my couch, and some colourful artworks on the wall. As we draw closer to the end of the first Creative Connection series, today being the penultimate session, we hope that you have found these webinars, which have explored leadership, artistic, and digital adaptation, to be a useful resource to help navigate these ever-changing times. A reminder that the whole series can be replayed on our website at any time. They are all Auslan interpreted, captioned, and there are copies of the speakers' PowerPoint presentations for download and copies of the transcripts also available. Just before I hand over to Rani and Lena, just a quick reminder that if you have attended one or more of these sessions, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Since commencing on the 1st of April, we've had over 8,000 people join us for these live sessions, as well as many more playing the recordings back online. Your responses are a really valuable way for us to better understand the outcomes of this program, to discover which sessions have been helpful in shaping and influencing your thinking during this time, and importantly, to help us guide programming. We'd love to bring you round 2 of Creative Connections. Thank you so much for taking the time to complete this short survey. We'll post a link in the chat now. And just quickly, a reminder of housekeeping. Live captioning is available via Zoom and can be toggled on or off using the CC button below if you're on a laptop, or above if you're on a mobile device. As always, please use the chat feature to engage with each other throughout today's session. Similarly, if you have a question at any point, please post it in the Q&A button rather than in the chat so we don't lose it and we can come back to it at the end. Today we're joined by Shavoy and Rebecca, who are Auslan interpreting for us, and Mile, who is live captioning. Thank you all for being here. Finally, a recording of today's webinar with transcript will be available after the session around mid next week, which we'll send to you via email along with the PowerPoint and any links and resources from today. So now on screen is a navy blue PowerPoint slide to introduce our guest speakers. There is a title to introduce Rani and Lena next to their headshots. Rani in the top left image is a person belonging to the global Chinese Indonesian diaspora. They are standing at a lectern with a microphone, wearing a black long sleeve jacket and red scarf with matching red lipstick. They have short cropped black hair. Lena in the bottom right image is a woman with wavy shoulder length brown hair and brown eyes. She is wearing a black top and round gold earrings and smiling directly at the camera. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Rani and Lena today, although I know many of you will know these incredible women well already. Rani, like many others in the arts, wears many hats. As an intercultural producer, an independent storyteller and public speaker, as well as an advocate for cultural equity. She is also the program producer at Theatre Network Australia, who we're really excited will be joining us for Future Form, our leadership program this year. Lena is currently the Executive Director of Diversity Arts Australia and the host of the Colour Cycle podcast. She has over 20 years experience in the arts, culture and media sectors, and many organisations have been the beneficiary of Lena's experience as their CEO, producer, curator or artistic director over the years. If you haven't already had the opportunity, I encourage you to check out Diversity Art's recent release of the Creative Equity Toolkit, which can be found on their website, and we'll post a link in the chat now. Today, Rani and Lena are here to talk to us about the importance of embedding art in research and what we stand to risk if we don't shift the balance of cultural equity. Over the course of the last year, Rani led a research process interviewing creative people of colour, which focuses on identifying the collective issues shared by creatives of colour, in trying to forge their careers in a white arts world. Their findings from this important research led to the development of Creatives of Colour, which we'll now share a link in the chat also, and Rani will be speaking to extensively today. Rani will share some of the processes and outcomes from this research with us, and equally Lena will be talking to us about some of the stats behind the Shifting the Balance report. Rani and Lena, thank you both so much for joining us today for this timely and important discussion. I'll now hand over to you, Rani. I believe you have some slides to share.
Sure do. Thanks so much, Francis, and good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you're zooming in from. So my name is Rani Pramesti, and I'm the daughter of Dini Yusuf and Oki Lukita. And my family clan names are Yusuf, Lim, Kwa, I, and Barura. And I'm also the co-facilitator of Creatives of Color. So before I show you my slides and begin, I do want to acknowledge country in my mother tongue of Bahasa Indonesia. So pertama-tama saya ingin mengutarakan rasa hormat saya kepada Tuan Tanah Negeri di mana saya berada, yakni kepada kebangsaan Kulin. I'm a person in my early 30s. I have straight, short, black and red hair, brown eyes and golden brown skin. Today I am wearing a bright magenta woolen jumper, a blue and pink beanie, and a deep blue scarf. My pronouns are they and she. So I'll just share my screen now to show you the homepage of Creatives of Color. So just give me a moment here. Can everyone see that okay? Yep. So on screen, sorry, I'm just navigating a few things here. So Creatives of Color, so on the screen, what you can see, what is on the screen are 3 people engaging in various creative activities. So there's one person taking a photograph, one person in dancing, and one person reading a book. And underneath are the words about Creatives of Color and an illustration of so-called Australia and a description of Creatives of Color, which is a shared space and online platform for creative people of color by creative people of color based on Kulin country in Melbourne.
Rani, can I just ask you to expand your screen? We just can see only a part.
Oh. You can only see.
Perfect. Thank you.
How do I do that if I also need to see my notes, Francis?
Would you like me to share the screen for
that might be better then. Yeah, just because I need to. Yeah.
Just bring it up for you. Sorry. Here we are.
Yep. Awesome. Yep. And if you just navigate in.
To research?
So you just, so just go down to the about. So if you just scroll down. Yep, and keep scrolling. Yeah, great, just stop there. So as I was saying, Creatives of Color is a shared space and online platform for creative people of color by creative people of color based on Kulin country in Melbourne. Our vision is for supportive, well-resourced, joyous and thriving creative communities of color. And just a bit about the term Creatives of Color itself. I'm referring to creative people of color, and I'm using that as a term of solidarity across a spectrum of racialized identities, bodies, and lived experiences to unite creative communities of color in our struggles. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge that the struggle of First Nations people for sovereignty is a unique struggle. And I also want to acknowledge the distinct lived experiences of Black identifying folks in particular. So what I'm going to share today is only one part of the Creatives of Color project. which is our research process and the findings from interviewing 60 creatives of color about the problems we experience when navigating a predominantly white Australian art sector. I also just want to acknowledge my co-facilitator, Komang Rosie Kleins, who has been doing this work with me. So Francis, if you don't mind just navigating to the research page now. And just stay on the top of the page for now. Yeah, great. So the research process that we, Rosie and I did, we were introduced to the method through a creative tech accelerator program. So what does that even mean? It was basically a program that we were both a part of that was trying to introduce creatives or artists to the lean startup methodology. So essentially how startups get their businesses off the ground. And one part of the methodology that we were introduced to is called the customer validation interview, which is where you interview a bunch of people from a particular demographic, and you try and find out what the problems / pain points are that people are experiencing in that demographic. And then the idea is that you then trial solutions to try and solve those problems. And Rosie and I, both individually, but also together, you know, we've had a series of unsafe experiences in navigating this predominantly white, so-called Australian art sector. And so long story short, I'm summarizing a lot here, but what we decided to do was to then apply the lean startup research methodology to the experiences of creatives of color. And alhamdulillah, we also received a Creative Victoria grant to do this work, which led us to conducting 60 phone or face-to-face interviews. So Francis, if you don't mind scrolling further down. So on the screen are the interview questions. So there's three main parts of the screen at the moment. On the left-hand side, you can see two buttons to download the PDF and Word versions of the research. In the center is a block of text, which I will be reading. And then on the right-hand side are animated illustrations of heads of people with various dark and tan skin color, with red hair, and or wearing a hat and headscarves, and they form the shape of a question mark. So what do you call it? So with the, sorry, hang on a second. Going through my notes here. So I'll just read the interview questions that we asked people. So firstly, we did ask for some migratory and as in like migration history information, and then demographic information from the interviewees. And then we asked them the same 8 questions, which is, how are you engaged in the arts? What is the hardest part about that role or that way of engaging in your experience? Can you tell me about the last time that happened? Why was this difficult for you? What solutions have you been trying to solve that problem? What don't you love about the solutions you have tried? What support do you need or would like to have for your work in the future? And what are you looking forward to in your creative career? So, a second. Then I'll just preface the next part by saying that what we're presenting today is a really humble offering of data. It's by no means exhaustive. And how we went about this interview process was that at the end of every interview, we would ask for recommendations of other people to contact. And so as you'll see in a minute, some demographics were more present than others. And then what we then did was, once we collated the qualitative and the quantitative data, I then worked with the same web development team that I collaborate with in Jakarta, Indonesia. And I collaborate with this team on my projects as a storyteller, working at the intersection of storytelling and technology. So Francis, do you mind scrolling? Sorry, Francis, go back up. Just at the, yeah, you see how you can scroll to the bottom of that box? Yeah. So I just want to touch on these areas for further research, because as I mentioned, some demographics were more present than others. So these are our recommendations of who you could target, we could target if we were to, get more resources to further extend on the research. Cool, so we'll move on to the demographics of the 60 interviewees. So on the screen is the title, demographics of the 60 interviewees, and then underneath that, the words personal background, and underneath that, a figure of a person. And then to the right of that figure are 4 bars, horizontal bars stacked, one on top of the other, that illustrates how 3 out of 60 interviewees identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and or Torres Strait Islander, 59 out of 60 identified as people of color, 32 out of 60, which is more than half, identified as LGBTQIA+ or queer, and then 18 out of 60 people identified as living with a disability. And if you scroll further down, Francis, so this next image is a pie chart that illustrates how also, most interviewees use multiple pronouns. They didn't just use one. They didn't just use she, her, or just he, him. And so what we've done here is illustrate how 68% included she, her in the pronouns that they used, and then 22% included they, them, and then 20% included he, him, and then 10% used pronouns that were, they were unsure, or they used other pronouns or had no preference. And moving on. So this next image is another series of vertical bars that illustrate the age range of the interviewees. So as you can, so from the image, you can, it's basically the majority of interviewees fell into the 18 to 35 years of age. And then there was a smattering of interviewees who were in the in the 36 to 55 years of age. And moving on, Francis. So this next image are a series of vertical bars, again in the color green. And most interviewees identified as coming from a mixed heritage. So it wasn't just, it wasn't just African heritage or Asian heritage. It was actually multiple and very complex heritages that people hailed from. But there are some patterns which this graph demonstrates, which is that 49 out of 60 interviewees included some sort of Asian heritage. There is a vast diversity within that, but they did include some Asian heritage in their lineage. 10 out of 60 included having African heritage. And again, there's huge diversity within that. But in terms of the patterns, that was what came through. 8 out of 60 identified as hailing from Polynesian or Pacifica heritage. And then 20 out of 60 included having European heritage in their lineage. And then there was a smattering of other cultural backgrounds that people hailed from, including Latinx, Caribbean, and so on. Cool, so we'll just move on to the next image, which shows an image of so-called Australia continent. And there are 3 icons of babies and that illustrate how 19 out of 60 interviewees were born overseas and then moved to Australia as a child. And then the middle baby figure shows that 23 out of 60 people were born in Australia. And then on the right-hand side, another baby figure, which shows how 18 were born overseas and then moved to Australia as an adult. So if we can just move on. So hang on, I'm just gonna have a quick sip of my tea. This next page shows, suppose 6 different boxes that illustrate, in each box there are 60 figures of people, and they're mostly gray, but they are in red or in green if they identified a certain problem. So the first problem that we identified through our research was the white lens and how it tokenizes and exotifies people of color. So in that box, you can see 34 out of the 60 figures are in red. The second problem, 19 out of 60 people spoke about this, which was struggling with money and unpaid labor, financial exploitation, financial insecurity, financial barriers, and classism. And then the next problem was 15 out of 60 people spoke about the mental health and emotional impacts of navigating a predominantly white art sector. So, and I quote, people spoke about feeling exhausted, drained, anxious, and even broken. The next problem, if you scroll down, Francis, 14 out of 60 people spoke about this, which was the grant/funding system being inaccessible. Now, I'll just I encourage everyone to have a look at these findings in more detail on the website, but for now, I'll just skip forward. Do you mind scrolling down, Francis? All the way down to the list of the top 12 problems. Yeah. So what is on the screen here are top 12 problems that we identified from the research. And you can see it's oh my gosh, it's massive and multi-layered, intersectional, and complex, basically. So what we've then done is, if you keep scrolling, Francis, so what we've done is we've collated a bunch of quotes to illustrate just how complex each problem is and just how nuanced everyone's experiences are. So we identified patterns, but it is really worth going to our website and reading through these quotes, because you get a sense of the complexity of every individual's experience in relation to these problems. So what I'll do is I will just read a couple of the quotes. So Francis, if you don't mind just starting at the top of problem number 1 there. So problem number 1 is the white lens and how it tokenizes and exotifies people of color. So 34 out of 60 people spoke to this. And I'll begin quote here. Systematically, my tokenism is really challenging. Most recently was a particular arts festival that used my name to try and get funding, but hadn't spoken to me. So they proposed that I was going to do this project, big public thing, then went on my website, but I had not been consulted. I even got mock-ups using images from my website. I felt like a form of currency. There was no consideration. They hadn't looked into my practice, doesn't understand what it's about, didn't look at the breadth of my practice to understand that I would not do this. I don't make public work. I don't just make work to display in billboards. It's what really irked me the most, that I would do this just because I would get money, end quote. So that was from a respondent working in visual arts. And I will say that on the page, you can also see illustrated images of people looking towards the body of text in the center of the page. Francis, do you mind clicking to the next button at the top there? Yep. If it's that, maybe scroll up, and it normally turns into like a clickable. There you go. Great. No, there you go. And right, I'll read a quote from this one, which is problem number 2, struggling with money and unpaid labor, financial exploitation, financial insecurity, financial barriers, and classism. So 19 out of 60 people spoke about this. Oh, let me see here. Maybe I'll go into, yeah, that first quote. So, and I begin quote, most challenging thing, it's not secure, not financially secure, but also just opportunity-wise. Communities I work with come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. It's not affordable to do an acting class or arts program, end quote. And that was from a respondent working in theater. I'll just move us on to the next problem, Francis. I do want to get to 2 more problems before moving on. So yeah, you just click on the next button at the top again, yeah. Oh, can you, sorry, go to the problem number 4. Yeah, I want to make sure I touch on that one. Oh, yeah, great. Okay, so 14 out of 60 people spoke about the grant/funding system being inaccessible. So I just wanted to read out this particular quote. The specific grants, so begin quote, the specific grants that one of my colleagues had identified were for, insert the name of the funding body, who would never give people like us a grant because of the process. We wanted to apply for grants specific for people with disabilities. Those grants were structurally designed, are still biased towards people who, because of their economic, racial background, still privileges people who have access in other ways. People who are white, people who acquire disabilities later in life, and prior to that had time to build careers. People who got to go to high school. My highest level of education is secondary because of ableism and racism combined. I had dropped out of university courses because of those specifically. To apply for grants like that, I'm at a disadvantage. Various levels of disabilities, education, even though they say we created these grants for people like you, end quote. And that was from a respondent working in community engaged art practice. So I thought I'd share that one in particular, because what we've been doing at Creatives of Color is once we started identifying some of these problems, we've then started to try and test solutions to try and solve these problems. So Francis, do you mind, either you can navigate to our Instagram page or I can try and share mine, I don't mind. Yeah, it's instagram.com/creativesofcolorau. So if you want to get to know our work a bit better, obviously there's our website, creativesofcolor.com, but there's also on our Instagram account, we are our latest offerings. And on the right-hand side there, today we're actually having a grant writing workshop to prepare for the upcoming Australia Council for the Arts and Creative Victoria grants. Those workshops are always really well attended, and because there's a need basically in the community, which our research identified. We're also hiring 2 new co-facilitators. These positions are reserved for a First Nations person and also for a Black identifying or Afro-diaspora person to join our team. So all of our offerings, which are on our Instagram account there, are exclusively for First Nations mob, Black identifying folks and people of color. White allies are welcome to forward the information to other First Nations mob, Black identifying people and people of color. And we received a relatively small grant actually to do this work. So for white allies especially, we do encourage you to donate and invest in this work, which you can find all of that information on creativesofcolor.com. And okay, I think that's enough for me. If you have any questions, feel free to pop it in the Q&A chat function. Thanks everyone. And thanks Francis for stepping in.
Hi, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Rani. Lena, I believe you've got some slides to share with us as well.
I'm sorry, I just was having a little bit of a stalling issue. I think it's going to rain because every time it rains, I have internet problems.
No worries. How are you going?
Good. Hopefully I'll be okay. That was really awesome, Rani. Thank you so much. Here we go.
Thanks, Lena.
Yeah, like the things are a little bit slow at my end, and I think it's the I'm just going to say the weather. Please work. Okay. How's that? Is that working?
Looks great.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Okay. So I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining today from the unceded lands of the Darug Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the First Nations people who are joining today and to extend my respect to them. I'd also like to acknowledge that diversity in all of its forms predates European colonisation in Australia. And so I speak from that understanding. This first slide is a title slide. It's orange and it's orange and red, and the title says Embedding Art in Research. It has the Diversity Arts logo on it and those words. It has the photo of me that was already described by Francis, and my name, Lena Nahlous, Executive Director, Diversity Arts Australia, and my Twitter handle at Lena Nahlous. So Diversity Arts is the national voice for ethnocultural and migrant racial equity in the arts, cultural and creative sectors. And by that, we mean we work to support and for people who identify as being from migrant and refugee backgrounds, from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, sometimes called CALD, or people of colour. There are a lot of different ways in which people choose to describe themselves, and a lot of ways in which people are described by others. And that's a whole other session that Rani and I could run. We do research, advocacy, targeted projects. We facilitate discussion through seminars and content production, like our Colour Cycle podcast and our mini films. We run training and capacity building programs, and we encourage the formation of communities of practice. So this next slide, okay, bear with me. This next slide shows a photo of a seated audience listening to a white woman with grey hair speaking in a black top. Her name is Jane Crawley from Creative Victoria, and she's speaking alongside an Auslan interpreter who is a brown-skinned man with dark hair and a maroon top and tan pants. And this is for our Shifting the Balance report launch, and just as an example of one of our events. Now, in around 2010, I took a bit of time away from the kind of art space that I now find myself back in. And during these years away, I had 2 children, I taught at TAFE, I worked as a social history and exhibitions curator, and I undertook some consultancy work, but I wasn't directly working in the racial equity advocacy space or in the arts advocacy space in the way that I am now. And I knew what was going on, you know, but I was an arm's length away from it. So when I returned to this space in this role at Diversity Arts Australia in 2016, I really felt the impacts and saw the impacts on others of the federal government funding cuts to the Australia Council, the sense of a sector being under siege, the reality of shrinking government funding for the arts, and the impacts of this on culturally diverse creatives and on their production. I also saw a reduction of structural support for creatives of colour, so less organisational support, sometimes less organisations and less networks, fewer opportunities for funding, and even more precarity, if that was even possible, for artists. Mirrored the increase in precarious labour in Australia and the world. So artists were doing even more jobs in addition to their practice. And not long after I started at Diversity Arts, I was also invited, we were invited as an organisation to lead conversations about cultural diversity in the creative sector as part of Arts Front. And it was specifically Paula Aboud and myself who were invited to do that. So Arts Front is a 4-year art sector visioning project led by Feral Arts that asks, what do we want the art sector to look like in 2030? And we were invited to participate to develop future policy for the arts, with our focus being on ethnocultural migrant diversity. This is an image of me with my young son and young daughter on either side of me. We are holding a sign that says #Create Australia's Future. We all have olive skin, brown hair and brown eyes. And this shows how I'm combining motherhood and arts advocacy since returning to this space. So it was within this context that I worked with the team at Diversity Arts and Paula Aboud to develop an approach which to undertaking consultation and gathering research and developing a structure for influencing arts policy that embeds artists and art making itself into the way in which we undertook advocacy. The state of the sector warranted an urgent need not only for advocacy but for research. Our remit was already at Diversity Arts to focus on underrepresented culturally diverse creatives who were marginalised within the creative sector, and there was significant evidence to show that they were being disproportionately affected by the sector's precarity. Advocacy work in the Australian creative sector is often quite reactive, and that's because and I felt like it was even more so since I returned. And there's good reason for that. That's because we often find ourselves on the back foot and needing to respond to situations really urgently, like, for example, reduced support for people who want to study in the creative arts or the arts fields is a recent example. And there's often an urgent need to respond. But when we're constantly addressing deficiencies and gaps like government funding cuts, imposed priorities, reduced autonomy and voice, it becomes difficult to conceive of social justice and racial equity in the arts as independent from this. And quite often our advocacy and our activism are only imagined in relation to state power and institutional reform. These limitations stand in the way of culturally diverse creatives collectively imagining avenues for real change or alternative avenues for futures that they want to create. In response to this, we developed a model or a way of working that would embed artists and art making into the research project process, where the outcomes included the art itself. And we called this our artist as advocate model, but also recognised that this phrase could sound quite instrumentalist, which was not the way in which we enacted it. So what I mean by this is that we weren't saying we'll simply use the art in the service of advocacy, but that the creation of and the art itself would direct and inform us about the ways in which we did our advocacy and research and would become the advocacy and research. And through established practices like practice-based research, creative work is a powerful way to explore social realities and uncover interesting threads. So we identified the need to undertake this research with creatives of colour to ensure that they were central. And I also should mention that through this, we were also very consciously thinking that we wanted to create employment opportunities as much as possible and put artists at the front. So we were actually looking at that in our budgets. How can we prioritise that this funding is going to artists predominantly, and we structured our budgets accordingly. We identified, how could we have these discussions? How could we undertake these consultations in ways that would not position creatives of colour on the back foot, where they would not start from a deficit position, and that would also allow artists and creatives to lead these conversations on their own terms and give them the freedom to do so in ways that went beyond speaking back to government and reacting to injustices. And this led to the birth of the Stories from the Future project, which positioned artists and arts making at its centre. I am going to talk about that as the main case study today. But one of the outcomes, was of the project has been an anthology called After Australia. And this slide that I'm now showing is a quote from my afterword in that anthology. And it says, "In situations of oppression, it's often difficult to escape from or think outside of the reality of the present day and the burden of the past. But when one is taken outside of the present, the possibilities for change can be immense." This slide says a spectrum of research approaches. So we need a range of research approaches. And we do this at Diversity Arts. We do more traditional forms of research as well. And I couldn't let this moment pass to not shamelessly talk about the Shifting the Balance report that we undertook and released last year, which is the first of its kind in Australia, where we surveyed 200 leading arts organisations across Australia in terms of leadership of people of colour or culturally and linguistically diverse people. Shifting the Balance is an example of a more conventional form of research, but it was really necessary alongside this other research because gatekeepers and decision makers kept telling us, you can't prove it. You cannot prove there's an underrepresentation in this way. So sometimes we do need this kind of research. This, and often we do. This image shows 3 copies of the Shifting the Balance report. They're in a kind of salmon colour, and there's stacked chairs on the cover, and so there's 3 copies of that. This next image is one of the graphics from the Shifting the Balance report. It's a pie chart that shows 51% of Australia's major arts organisations have no culturally and linguistically diverse representation within their organisations at the board level, executive level, leadership level. This report serves as an anchor for policy, but it has its limitations. It didn't involve artists and creatives in the same way that Stories from the Future did, and the possibilities are limited in that sense. So this next slide says, creative advocacy. And so alongside this more traditional means of collecting data, we also wanted to embed artists and creatives and involve them in every step of the process. This next slide has a yellow background with a big red font, 70% written, and it says 70% of diversity arts advocacy and research work directly employs and engages artists and creatives. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on one of our most widespread national projects, Stories from the Future, which takes an action-based or participatory-based research approach that a lot of you will be familiar with. So it's collaborative, it's co-designed, it's co-research, and the research itself is about making change. The next slide says Stories from the Future in a kind of futuristic font. So this was a futuring workshop series which we ran in WA, South Australia, the ACT and New South Wales, with so far over 150 creatives of colour, and we plan on running more. COVID has put a little bit of a break on some things, but we're redesigning it for online delivery. And the idea is to bring creatives together from across Australia to discuss their experiences in the sector, imagine alternative futures, and collectively build a timeline of an equitable arts and creative sector to 2050. And I'll talk more about that. So it's a very distinctive approach in the sense that the process of creative production is also a mode of inquiry to explore other ways of working, creating and envisioning the sector. Research is conducted through artistic practice itself. It's not separate to it. It's an active creative process. The art itself is, as I mentioned, is central to the advocacy plan. And this is significant because we all know that art has the power to change the ways people experience and understand the world, to shift perceptions and to connect people in what, and the possibilities are kind of endless in the way that art has that power to kind of tell stories and really disrupt. And why work in the advocacy art space and not actually engage with art itself? Artists are leading the conversations, and what they create informs the research we do and the policy change we advocate for. So this next slide shows a photo of a Stories from the Future workshop where there's around 12 people sitting in a circle with workshop facilitator Dr. Rani Lowe, who is speaking. In the background, there are post-it notes on a board. This approach increases the agency of creatives and artists as they're embedded into every stage of the project, and we're documenting and collecting data. We're also creating art simultaneously. The research outcomes are artist-led and artist-determined. Importantly, the structure enables creatives. I feel like I might be a little bit repetitive here. They're leading the conversation. We're actively listening and providing a platform and community. So how did we do the project? We partnered with the very amazing Dr. Rani Lowe from the University of Sydney, who was already running futuring workshops to develop and facilitate a kind of art-specific futuring workshop nationally. Remy is the facilitator of the workshops and worked with us to design the workshop, and we ran a few and got feedback from the creatives and changed it several times until we got the model, until we got a model that worked for us. The workshop framework was non-prescriptive and gave creatives the freedom to determine the priorities, the discussions and the approaches to change. But it also took people outside of their current day to imagine the possibilities that weren't just in response to the realities of today. So the next image that I'm showing is Dr. Rani Lowe, who's pictured on the slide. He looks youngish, maybe in his 30s. He has a slim build and a dark black long sleeve shirt on, short black hair and glasses. and brown skin, and he's smiling. And there's a quote of him saying, what we did was we imagined 30 years from now, 2050, imagining a group of people sitting around like this. Dr. Rani Nahlous, Stories from the Future Facilitator. This next slide is shows a person's arm with a pen or a texter writing on butcher's paper for a group brainstorming activity. The notes on the paper show the discussion is about representation in storytelling. The next slide of the Stories from the Future workshop shows the back of a person with long black hair in a ponytail and a checkered black and white shirt, looking at a wall of post-it notes, which are pink, yellow, and green from the Stories from the Future workshop. So through these workshop series, we were inviting culturally diverse artists to imagine alternative futures. Through the workshops flowed from the personal to the structural and systemic. They included exercises that reflected upon experiences of marginalisation in the arts, to group exercises of collectively imagining milestones and actions along a timeline towards an equitable, diverse arts future in 2050. And the idea is that we will synthesize all of these timelines across the country that have been developed, and from them develop a series of recommendations and actions and initiatives that we'll then seek support to deliver over the next few years. And while they were focused on ethnocultural migrant diversity, including a specific workshop for people from refugee backgrounds, the workshops were also open to First Nations people through our partnership with Sweatshop around the After Australia Anthology, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit. How am I doing for time? Am I going okay for time? A bit worried. If I'm not, please let me know. So this next slide shows a table of significant objects from Stories from the Future. Some include a painting of a mother and son, books and jewellery. This is where people were asked to bring in significant objects for them as one of the activities and to talk about these. So how am I doing for time?
Need to wrap up in a few minutes. Yeah, we've gone a bit over already, but that's okay.
Okay.
If everyone's happy to stay and is engaging with this, then please just if we can have about 5 minutes to wrap up, and then we'll see if any questions come through.
So do I have 5 minutes or 3 minutes? I have 5.
Let's do 5 and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, I can do it. Okay. Okay, so as I said, this came out of Arts Front, to imagine, the future, to engage artists into imagine the future. Within these workshops, we embedded writers as citizen journalists, and also writers who then wrote speculative fiction and other fictional pieces that were published in an anthology called After Australia in partnership with Affirm Press and Sweatshop. In the first month that it was launched a few months ago, in its first month, it actually sold more copies than most Australian anthologies do in their lifetime. And I'm mentioning that because this is one of the outcomes of the Stories from the Future project that shows the kind of power of art, and in this case, kind of writing, to reach communities more broadly and to engage communities in these discussions. We also embedded citizen journalists who wrote reflections on the workshops, which were published in SBS Live, Peril Magazine, Overland, ABC Online. And as you can see, the conversations took different forms. We embedded a researcher, Kiri Zakanthianos. Apologies, she recently changed her name, so I needed to practice that. We also worked with filmmaking collective Phoenix Eye to collect interviews and produce short films. And, for these workshops, one of the research outcomes will be to publish a report, as I mentioned, that is a series that makes a series of recommendations and has that synthesized kind of timeline to the future. These workshops were incredibly important for the people who participated, and the feedback has reflected that it was a really necessary space and has been a very affirming space and positive space. So this next slide is an image of Francisco Lopez, who is a black-haired, dark-skinned person with a light shirt, and he has said the workshop allowed some really good space to really reflect on what we think about the landscape and where we want it to be. The next slide is an image of Tien Zhao, who identifies as Chinese, from being from a Chinese background. She is speaking in front of a microphone and has dark long hair with light bits at the bottom and a dark top. And she says this workshop was really valuable in actually creating a sense of a future that was collective. When people come together, they gain an understanding of symptoms of something larger, of systemic issues. So as some of the articles that were published, there's 2 examples on screen, and the headlines is Artificial Intelligence, the Answer to Loneliness by Daniel Slayman, and Islandless Islanders, The Very Real Threat of Climate Change by Winnie Dunn. These were both published on SBS Voices. And the next slide is of the After Australia anthology, the anthology of 12 writers of First Nations and culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, edited by Michael Muhammad Ahmed. And the cover features a 1950s style vintage illustration of a white nuclear family, a mom, dad, son and daughter, with their faces scribbled out. And the next image shows Michael Muhammad Ahmed, who is a dark-skinned man. He has shaved hair, a little goatee, dark eyes and dark eyebrows in a black shirt. And it's his article that he wrote for The Guardian about the After Australia anthology, titled Speculative Fiction, Who Among Us Could Have Guessed Our Current Reality? And the next article, and I'm showing you these to show you how far-reaching this research has been, this advocacy can be when we embed artists in. So this is another article on ABC News written by Hannah Reich, and it shows, and the title of the article is Australian Writers Ponder Future Ravaged by Climate Change. Pandemic is Speculative Fiction Anthology in Speculative Fiction Anthology After Australia. The influence of this research and advocacy approach is that it's about shifting culture, not just imposing targets. And I'm a big believer in imposing targets, but it's not going to shift systemic racism. At the end of the day, targets are a response that retrofits a system that doesn't accommodate us. And I'm not using that at all as an argument to not argue for targets. So we know that this project isn't finished yet. We want to run more workshops. We want to gather more regional voices, and we want it to be more national. In other states and territories we haven't yet worked in for this project. So it's still in process, but we do know that, you know, already we've commissioned a lot of work that has been far-reaching, you know, 10 short films, around 10 or more articles that have all been published, 12 pieces of fiction that have been published in an anthology that has had some significant kind of readership and media attention. And we are still working on that report that will synthesize the timelines, and there'll be more outcomes, you know, and we'd love to share these with you in the future. And, you know, I think that we're beginning to get a grip on the influence of this work and its impact, and it's harder to measure than, you know, more traditional means of research. But it's, yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's not measurable, because it is. And the next slide is just really the end slide, just summarizing what I've spoken about. It says, summary, gathering. What we did was gather creatives together to talk about their experiences and do creative exercises that would take them outside of the current space. We use prospective futures as a model. The second is create new work. We supported creatives to make new work, document the process. So at every stage of the process, we've embedded creatives to document and reflect on it. Multiple outcomes. you know, research, books, films, stories by citizen journalists, essays. The artistic process itself proliferates ideas and creating a non-prescriptive space to bring forth ideas and issues, but a framework that wouldn't prompt what the artist wanted to discuss, but yeah, allow them to do that. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks so much, Lena, and sorry to hustle you along at the end there. It's I think everyone's really stayed with us, which has been great. So it's a testament to, you know, this is really important work, and people really want to learn more. So thank you for continuing with us. I'll just share my last couple of slides that we have. So unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions today, but I can see that there's been a couple come through, mostly around the interest in sort of partnerships and in research and resources that you could suggest. So what I might do, if it's okay with Hannah and the other person who's anonymous, I think, who's asked those questions, if you wouldn't mind sending us an email to leadershipprogram@australiacouncil.gov.au, or we can reach out to you and pass that question on to Lena, and maybe we can connect you that way to follow up with those. But thank you again for joining us, Lena and Rani. I wondered if there was any final thoughts you wanted to leave anyone with to take away from today's session.
I might maybe say one thing, which is that, again, just encouraging everyone to have a look at the research on creativesofcolor.com. And I think one of the things that we learned from listening to people was how even before COVID, certain groups of people were already in crisis, you know, in terms of their experience of the art sector. So it's quite interesting, I suppose, now with the pandemic, some of the conversations that I've been privileged enough to listen in on, in terms of like whose survival is being prioritized in this time. And we've also been hearing from some of the communities that we are working with in terms of people who are in survival mode right now, and therefore don't have the capacity to advocate for a better, safer, healthier, more relevant, more inclusive, more equitable art sector. So yeah, I suppose it's more just some questions that I've been having rolling around, I suppose, in my mind, you know, and I feel like there's been some conversations where, oh, but we can't think about diversity, which, you know, is a problematic word in some ways, but, you know, I would rather like, oh, we can't think about justice, or, oh, we can't think about equity right now because we're too busy trying to survive. And if that ever comes up in any of the spaces that you are all in, I think we need to really question, well, whose survival are you thinking of? Yeah. Probably enough for me.
Thank you, Rani. That's, yeah, really wonderful note to leave us on. And I encourage you all to follow Creatives of Colour on Instagram, and Lena Nahlous on her Instagram as well, and to reach out and to continue these conversations. Before we go, just a quick note that next Wednesday is our very final Creative Connections of this series. So we hope you will join us. It will be on gendered leadership. So continuing on the vein of thought with independent writer Vincent Silk, who will be joining us to talk about our approaches to gender diversity within practices and within our practices and organisations. So until next time, thank you again, Rani and Lena, for being here, to our Auslan interpreters, Shavoy and Rebecca, our live captioner, Mille, and my wonderful team, Laura and Ian, working behind the scenes. And of course, thank you to all of you, and thank you for staying with us. We hope you'll join us again next Wednesday. Bye.